And he's an inning eater, doing a lot of introductions and stuff for the colloquia here. He gets a night off. He's not in the bullpen. He's in the bench kind of beyond the bullpen. I'll stop with that.
The IL.
Ice on his shoulder. That's what I'm looking for. I know everybody here. It was great to see everybody. I'm supposed to start with 2 announcements. I'm going to begin with a little teaser for what we're going to have in a little bit here to say that Secession is kind of in the air at the Kinder Institute. We'll let that linger. Not to double entendre at all, but Secession, and it's actually been in the air for quite some time. I'll come back to that in a second. But I have the housekeeping things. I was supposed to say first that there's wonderful news that this seminar, I guess 2 things that's wonderful about it. First is it's not our last seminar of the year or of the semester, which apparently was tweeted out. That is absolutely not the case. There's going to be one more it's on Friday, December 3rd will be our last one, which shall double up as a Christmas party. Is that right? So wear your Santa hats and everything like that. Bring your mince pies, for those of you who know what that means. No, okay. The other bit of good news is that this is one of our sponsored events this year, so we're going to have a big supply, or we have a big supply of Logboat beer, a more normal supply. Not like the peanut butter and jelly ale, but like just the standards are there. So we look forward to everyone having a celebratory drink after that. Okay, back to Secession being in the air. I was thinking about this, and if you look back at many of our events in the last, say, 18 months or so, a surprising number of them have dealt with secession in one way or the other. I'm thinking about some of Lawrence Goldman's papers on Brexit. I'm thinking about Ken Owen's distinguished lecture on secessionism in American history. I'm thinking about the comments of Gary Kramer a couple of weeks ago at the event at the State Historical Society of Missouri. It wasn't actually about secession, but kind of actually was in the way he read Missouri's historic resistance to federal central authority. So it's been in the air. And we're going to get a different angle into this topic from outside of the United States, because, of course, this is not a uniquely American phenomenon at all. We're going to hear about a settler society that shares a lot of characteristics, political and cultural characteristics with the United States in Australia, Western Australia, in a slightly different time period in the early and mid 20th century. Okay, so first, we have 2 speakers today. They're going to do a duo. We're going to call them the Secessionist Duo today. Okay.
Let's not let that get put around.
The first one is Rob Fletcher, and I was thinking, I don't think Rob's been introduced for an event yet. Can we give Rob a round of applause? The longest appointment process in the history of the English-speaking world because of COVID, and it took 2 years for him to actually get here. He's here, he's teaching. We're so glad to have Rob. I just say that I don't know anyone that's got a better range of knowledge, but then is more tactical, deft about deploying that knowledge on behalf of specific arguments. So he has this reservoir of information, but he can draw on it, he can manipulate it in all kinds of different ways. A very rare, I think, feature of a historian. It's wonderful to have this kind of historian that kind of makes all of us better when we're around him. That's the best thing I can say about any colleague. He's a historian of the British Empire. You'll know his first book was about Britain and the Middle East and nomadic peoples in the interwar period, the 1920s and 30s. And here's that range. The second book then moved back in time, mid-19th century, of Britain's encounters, commercial encounters in East Asia with Japan in particular. He's working on a couple of things now. Locusts, big project, environmental history of locust plagues He's working on a massive history of Britain and desert societies, desert spaces. And then, oh yeah, he's doing stuff like this that I didn't even really know that he was doing, but stuff like this, projects, in this case, on Western Australia. Which brings me to our other speaker, Ben Mountford. If Ben can, okay, he's responding, he can hear us, he's there. Ben Mountford, lots to say about Ben. I just want to say this. One of the things I most regret about COVID, and you can tell I didn't have a horrible COVID experience, so I forgive that preface to this. One of the things I most regret is Ben was going to bring a group of Australian students on our English spring break trip. And we were going to bring our American students, and then there was going to be a big quiz bowl on Thursday night, and we were going to clobber them. We were going to clobber those Australian students. We can't do it this year. They're still like, their situation with COVID far different than ours here. So we can't do it this year, but I look forward, Ben, to that challenge next time when you're allowed off your island. I look forward to that competition. Ben's been here before. I called him the Secessionist duo because you might recall he was part of the Gold Rush Trio. Remember the Gold Rush Trio came here and gave a paper about the global history of gold rushes, one of the publications that Ben is part of. He's the author of a really good book about Britain, China. It's called Britain, China, and Australia, I think. But a lot of us Americans will have read about the open door policy in the case of the United States' encounter with East Asia and China. You should read Ben's book, and you'll find a lot of similarities in Britain's encounter, but you also find some differences. Really important study. And he's leaned into the Australian history as he's repatriated from England back to Australia. I've talked enough. These guys are going to do their thing. This is going to be, I think, a little less formal than some of ours. This is a work in progress. So they're going to talk a little bit about a secession of Western Australia, give their thoughts, and then there's going to be plenty of time for discussion and questions. So let's welcome Rob and Ben to
Thanks very much, everybody. In the spirit of doing this in the 21st century style, I think, Ben, you should start by saying hello.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I just check my audio is coming across the wire? Okay, well,
Yep, sounds good to me, Ben. Off you go.
great. Good afternoon, everybody. A very important here in Ballarat, in Eastern Australia, not the part of Australia Rob and I will be talking about today. I'm about an hour from Melbourne. Jay's wonderful introduction and his own I can't be with you in person. It was at 8 o'clock in the morning with a promise of free cases of beer, always attractive to Australians. The question of the secession duo we might back to very soon. But let me just extend my thanks to Linda for everything they do. As Jay said, I was a great beneficiary of spending some time with you way back in 2017 with everything we did. Really does feel like ancient history. I'm looking forward to reconnecting with, as Jay says, we're allowed off the island. It turns out Australia is a really good place to quarantine people. There must be some sort of historical residency. I'd also just like to thank Rob. As Jay said, I think you're an incredibly big hand to be a professor. This newspaper partly comes about because I'm talking to Rob. I thought being an expert in Japanese, Middle Eastern, environmental history, Rob being to broaden his horizons, and so I suggested he should become an Australian history as well. So our talk today, it's a little bit of a work in progress, and I hope as we talk through the sense of some of the evolution project, both as Rob and I were both based in Britain during the Scottish referendum and campaign for Brexit, and as it's kind of evolved with COVID. I should just, as a personal, for any procrastinators out there, this project might also be the assurance that if you sit on a project long enough, you're not bound to come back into fashion. So don't refresh it to publish your life if you feel like you have a slightly deep topics. So what I wanted to do is to take me away, if I could, from the Hello Boys of Agenda, to a place, as Jay said, artistic in time and space, the state of Western Australia in the 1930s, and to share the current research Rob and I do on the impact of that state's campaign on the wider course of British imperial affairs in the 1930s. Mark Twain famously wrote Australian history. It was almost always picturesque. Indeed, it's so curious and strange that it is itself the chiefest novelty the country has to offer, and it so pushes the other novelties into second and third place. It does not read like history, but like the most beautiful lives, and all this a fresh new source, no moody or old stale. It is full of surprises and adventures, and congruities, and contradictions, credibility, but they are all true. They will happen. Now, I don't set Mark too high in training to Australian history, but what I would like to do today is introduce what, at least until the time of the pandemic, was a remarkably underappreciated episode of Australian history, and really coming to the crux of what we want to say in almost completely ignored episode in British imperial history. In Australia, at the moment, the nation's very distinctive experience of the pandemic, which James mentioned, has led to a dramatic assertion of state-based health councils, and so the Australian Federation has really come into question in a way that hasn't been for a very long time. We've seen much greater political and public prominence of state premiers, and the assertion of their authorities health sits generally with state premiers, so their power and public visibility has really increased very significantly. And this has been particularly pronounced in the case of Western Australia, which, to all intents and purposes, despite a few exceptions, has basically had no COVID during the course of the pandemic. They've had a few mini lockdowns where there's been scares, but essentially has been COVID-free. To give you some sense of the contrast with the rest of Australia, where Melbourne was in deep lockdown, my brother was enjoying FaceTime from the music festival. This is all led to the Premier of Western Australia, the Labor leader, who's both Premier and Australian Treasurer, enjoying unprecedented levels of political support. Judging by which poll you go to its peak, about 91% support, and at the recent state election, they absolutely decimated conservative opposition in Western Australia. And if there's time for a more chat with Rob and I might share with some of the popular pictures of the Premier. Needless to say, he's known as the daddy Premier to many people in Western Australia. I won't explore that in too much detail. But essentially, part of the strength has been setting Western Australia's identity, Western Australia's position against the Conservative government, federal government in Canberra, and contrast with positions very closely. Although the Allies closed borders for fiscal conservatism, the state amazingly just returned $5 billion state surplus, in contrast to all the other Australian states and federal government. It led New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet to describe it as being like gold cowering decay with its precious surplus. To most Western Australians, however, the government appeared much more like Frodo, determined despite the scale of the forces arrayed against him to stand up for the Shire and defend its way of life against the trouble in the East. And so, although research topic has a very strong contemporary reason, and discuss that further if there's any interest. What we thought would be really valuable. Sorry, I might just ask. Someone might be off the mute, I think. Sorry, I'm just hearing a non-secession related conversation. So Rob and I really picked up this question, I guess, in the context, as I said, of working in Britain in the lead up, particularly with the Scottish referendum in 2014, but also the developing debates about Brexit. And with that little intro, I'll hand over to Professor Fletcher.
Thanks, Ben. Well, the case of WA secession not only had obvious parallels with these contemporary events, a sweeping constitutional change brought about by referendum, the implementation of which would try the patience of the saint, Brexit. It also posed a problem for us as historians, because its treatment in the existing literature was somewhat unsatisfactory. Few general surveys of Australian history mention this bid for secession at all, and when they do, there's a strong disinclination, shall we say, to take it seriously. Frank Crowley, the great historian of Western Australia, called it a curious political event, which many of those who voted for did not really want anyway, he argued. F.R. Beasley, writing at the time, thought its significance much exaggerated, both inside and outside the state. In this respect, the Secessionist delegation that actually went to London to argue their case was perhaps its own worst enemy. They set themselves up for ridicule, and historians have sneered in condescension ever since. Take the petition they presented in triplicate to the House of Commons, the Lords, and the King. It was on a roll of sheepskin 26 foot long and encased in a jar or casket, wood from the southwest corner of the state, much to the amusement of cynics back in Australia at the time. Upon their arrival in London, the delegation flew the flag of the proposed Dominion of Westralia, a flag with no formal recognition, of course, from the roof of Savoy House on the Strand. And the songs sang at secessionist meetings. Well, let them speak for themselves. Where all her dales are blossoms and bright her beauty shines, from opals in her sunsets to the gold that's in her mines. Where all the winds are poets and praise and chant and troll, the roses in her sunrise, the hope that stirs her soul. Well, there are problems, however, in treating this movement so lightheartedly. The first is that doing so was actually a tactic of secession's opponents at the time. The Melbourne Argus, for example, cringing at the secessionists' misplaced hopes for securing their deliverance from Canberra in London, dismissed their case as a curious but not significant contribution to empire history. In Britain, the cabinet took the line that this was a dispute over tariffs to be resolved between the Australian states, a conscious attempt to narrow the issues at stake, to reduce it to a mere economic set of grievances, and to frame it as a purely national matter. All points fiercely contested by the secessionists themselves. Legal and constitutional scholars have paid the secession referendum more attention, one of them ranking it probably the most serious question mark over the territorial integrity of Australia in all the periods since Federation, with the exception of the threat of Japanese invasion. Now, this legal scholarship is really useful for us. It explains in sedulous detail the twists and turns that led British parliamentarians to ultimately conclude, and I quote from the terse questions in the comments about this decision, that although it would be within the strict legal competence of the United Kingdom Parliament to pass such separating legislation, it would not be within the constitutional powers of the Parliament to do so. Again, however, this focus on mechanisms and procedure was also part of the tactics of secession's opponents at the time. And to our mind, it does a bit of a disservice to understanding a movement which had built in the state over a longer period of time, which secured the support of 2/3 of voters, and which has not quite disappeared as cleanly and abruptly as some had hoped.
In our paper today, Rob and I want to take the discussion over West Australian secession in a slightly different direction, and to focus on its resonance not so much in terms of Australian history, but instead to share with you the work we're doing to locate secession within the wider context of imperial politics in the interwar period. Here we're particularly interested in how the WA secession campaign became involved in a series of imperial debates about the composition and governance of the British world system at a pivotal moment in its history. And our overarching goal really is to see what light the WA secession movement throws on the challenges of managing imperial affairs in the interwar period. Basically, if somewhere like Western Australia wished to make changes to the organisation of imperial affairs by line of region and empire, what hope would have of holding its ethnically and culturally diverse, geographically dispersed, politically divergent and polyglot imperial system together, particularly in the midst of economic depression, mounting anxiety at home about Britain's own international and internal challenges. And Rob and I have often, I suppose, visualised this of this chap here, J.H. Thomas, the Colonial Secretary, sitting in his desk with these issues piling up and going, oh great, now we've got one from Western Australia as well. So folks, I just want to turn a little bit to Thomas now, who's this Secretary of State for the Dominions, just to give you some context on the organisation of British government architecture. Prior to the 1930s, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, many of you know Sir Joseph Chamberlain, who we'll come to in a moment, had had responsibility for essentially the whole empire apart from India. It had its own office. What happens in the 1930s is that the dominions, the settler colonies, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, get their own Secretary of State. The Secretary of State for the colonies handles the rest of the empire, and this empire of Greater Britain, the settlement empire, is split off into its own sort of new office under Thomas. And it was on the evening of the 26th of October 1933 that Thomas delivered a speech broadcast on the BBC entitled "The Empire in World Politics." Worldwide cooperation, Thomas reflected, is for the moment in great difficulties, but there is within the world a group of nations and peoples called the British Empire, covering between them more than a quarter of the Earth's surface and including nearly a quarter of the human race, in which cooperation has not only not failed, but is living and growing. At a time of global and economic and diplomatic crisis, Thomas reflected, empire provided hope for Britons at home and abroad. While international relations was grounded on a desire to avert war, imperial relations, underpinned by a commitment to cooperation, liberty and democracy, could aspire to much loftier heights, to the positive end of achieving good and not merely the negative end of avoiding evil. The Imperial Conference of 1926 and the Balfour Declaration, both of which Thomas had been involved with the organisation of, had declared the United Kingdom and the British Dominions autonomous communities within the British Empire. This unique political association, Thomas suggested, was pregnant with promise for the whole world. Grounded on the inherent love of personal liberty and self-government in the races which make up the empire, a commitment to democracy, there was no shock it cannot withstand, no strain it cannot resist. The empire, Thomas concluded, was a new experiment in history. The empire has proved that it is possible for free and independent nations to join together, not merely to meet a temporary emergency, but in a permanent union, in which each member retains absolute freedom, but all endeavour to consult the interests of all. The union is deeply rooted in our common allegiance to the Crown. This unique political association, Thomas suggested, would reshape the course of world history. It was unsurprising, perhaps, that by late 1933, Thomas and other British leaders were seeking to reassure the public as to the empire's capacity to manage its internal tensions and negotiate what was becoming, of course, an increasingly fraught international scene. As Dominion Secretary in MacDonald's second national government after the 1931 general election, Thomas had managed a number of significant issues, including the negotiation of imperial and trade agreements at the 1932 Ottawa Conference and the response to De Valera's efforts to assert Irish Free State autonomy. But as Thomas' speech was broadcast on the BBC, another issue, as you will guess, was gathering pace. In Perth, Western Australia, newspapers reported Thomas's BBC broadcast, accounts of which had been received by the official British wireless. There, however, attention was primarily focused on a question which had come to dominate WA politics and which touched Thomas's themes of imperial cooperation, free association, and self-government, the potential secession of the state from the Australian Commonwealth. By mid-October, some 6 months after West Australians, as Rob said, had voted overwhelmingly in favour of secession at a statewide referendum, Western Australia's Executive Council had endorsed the appointment of a special committee charged with preparing a formal case for secession. This process, predicted Perth's Sunday Times newspaper, would provide an unanswerable case for the liberation of WA from the Australian Federation. In much of the existing work on WA secession, as Rob mentioned, the decision by voters in 1933 tends to be understood simply as an act of protest against the economic and political disadvantages of what was a primary producing, small population and, of course, enormous territory state, exacerbated by the trauma of the Great Depression. Likewise, Western Australia's subsequent attempt to petition the British Parliament to pass legislation which would enable WA to leave the Australian Commonwealth can be recognised as little more as a grand political gesture to embarrass the Commonwealth government and to force the federal government in Canberra to take better care of those citizens living in the western third of the country. So in most studies of this topic, it tends to be seen as basically a giant lobby exercise. You know, the vote for secession is secured, no one takes it very seriously, but it's a nice rod with which to hit Canberra and embarrass it internationally in terms of providing more funds to Western Australia. Back to you, Professor.
Thank you. We're trying to put you in the middle of this this group here, but we'll see how it works. One way to kind of yeah, we'll put you as Prime Minister temporarily. Prime Minister is just instant field promotion. One way that you can map out conventional narratives about this saga of secession is to look at 4 of its principal characters. So in the blue corner, true blue, what is tempted to say, are Henry Keith Watson and Hal Colbatch. Watson, born in Southern Cross, WA in 1900, was a tax consultant and public accountant in Perth before his entry into state politics. A co-founder and later chairman of the Dominion League of Western Australia, Watson was secession's most ardent champion, a propagandist for the cause in the run-up to the referendum, and the most active of the delegation who brought the resulting petition to London. A true believer, it was perhaps no surprise that of all the secessionists, he, most of all, would turn in anger on London and the British Parliament when the petition was rejected, accusing the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Dominion's office of bad faith and pledging to bring about secession somewhat ominously by other means. Hal Colbatch also supported secession, but did so very differently. Born in 1872 in England, Colbatch grew up in South Australia before working on the newspapers of the Western Australian goldfields and then entering politics. Colbatch twice served as WA's Agent General in London, its chief representative in the Imperial capital. And in 1933, the referendum year, he'd just begun his second stint in this very important position. While Colbatch favoured secession, he had his finger on the pulse of Westminster politics and a better appreciation of the challenges that lay ahead. The Dominion's office thought him a skillful political operator. Even so, in private, Colbatch doubted the delegation's prospects. Raising the state's profile and airing its grievances might actually, he suspected, be the best that they could hope for. Now against them, this is where I'm going to demote you, Ben, to being merely Agent General for Western Australia. Against them in the red corner, or is that the shade of imperial pink, stood Joseph Lyons and James Henry Thomas. Now, Joe Lyons, Australia's 10th Prime Minister, had emerged through Tasmanian state Labour politics before moving to the Conservative side in the face of economic and fiscal challenges posed by managing the Great Depression. He came to power in 1931 as the leader of a new United Australia party. A Roman Catholic with Irish nationalist sympathies and the former premier of a small state which had its own concerns about federation, Lyons had led a desperately unsuccessful federal delegation to Western Australia to oppose secession in the lead up to the referendum. And once the referendum had passed, he focused on downplaying the legitimacy of the West Australian issue, though it's notable that both he and his Attorney General, Robert Menzies, both came to London in 1935 as the petition's viability was being decided. Visiting Mussolini and Roosevelt during the same journey to press his anxieties about the international situation, it seems highly likely that Lyons was at least moderately concerned about the challenge to Australia's own political stability presented by the arrival of the WA delegation. And then finally, Thomas, we've heard a bit from already, a Welshman of Newport with a background in trade union politics. Thomas's response to the moves of the secession delegation was careful, cautious, and predicated upon funneling the secession petition down legal and procedural tunnels and into specific committees, rather than letting it air its broader grievances in public. In theory, acting as an impartial adjudicator, Thomas's opposition to secession itself comes out through the Dominion's office correspondence, and would lead to accusations that he had not been an honest broker.
Thanks, Rob. Ladies and gentlemen, these are our main characters and the main characters in most accounts of secession, and they all loom large in our story too. But what has surprised us most is how framing WA secession as an imperial affair has brought a wider, eclectic cast of personalities into view. And I should just intercede, Rob, it's not occurred to me until you show that image how ridiculous turning up with these enormous sheepskin t-shirts must have actually been in physical. To anyone who's caught a tube or endured the horrors of Heathrow, I can only imagine Paul Watson turning up with these two enormous petitions under his, so it must have been quite a logistical challenge. But turning this into an imperial story, what comes into view, as Rob said, is a series of interesting players from across the empire. Canadian lawyers, Scottish and Irish nationalists, British sympathisers, Tory diehards, and even the princely states of India. Some of these leads we'll be exploring tonight, others we're still in the process of following up. Let us give you a survey of where we're up to. And we might start just by going back to give you a little bit of this, more of this imperial context. By the 1930s, the influence of secessionist ideas had already been a recurring theme in West Australian politics. Whilst Britain's eastern Australian colonies had achieved self-government in the 1850s and the middle of the 19th century, the vast, relatively thin populated colony of Western Australia had only achieved self-government in 1890, so very close to the Australian Federation in 1901. As a result, as the movement for federation gathered steam, West Australian colonial leaders were in no rush to surrender their newfound powers of self-government and embrace the push to unite the colonies, which had really begun to take off. There'd been sort of numerous attempts to approach it through the 1890s when it starts to gather steam. Economic concerns, particularly the potential loss of intercolonial tariffs, combined with the lack of affinity many sandbrokers, as West Australians are known, felt for the East, stifled West Australians' federal enthusiasm. In the end, however, the WA government was coaxed into federation by a combination of the carrot and the stick. On the one hand, the promise of an intercontinental railway and of Section 95, which basically allowed WA to phase down its intercolonial tariffs more slowly than the other colonies. And the threat, particularly that the wealthy goldfields region might secede to join the Federation, leaving the rest of Western Australia as a rather uneconomic rump, forced basically the West Australians into joining. There was also quite a bit of direct pressure applied by Joseph Chamberlain, who you can see on the left there, the famous Secretary of State for the Colonies. Chamberlain warned the West Australian Premier, John Forrest, who you can see on the right there, that the writing was on the wall. Your responsible advisors, Chamberlain informed Forrest somewhat menacingly, will of course take into consideration the effect of the agitation of the Federal Party, especially on the goldfields, if Western Australia does not enter as an original state. It seems to me, under the circumstances, of the utmost importance to the future of Western Australia to join at once. Forrest, of course, duly took WA into the Federation, but in introducing the requisite legislation, observed that the Commonwealth is never separate again, unless, of course, we are separated by an Act of Imperial Parliament. That would be the only thing. An Act of Imperial Parliament could separate us, as it now unites us. Australia's constitution was, as every school kid knows, a Westminster system. In the lower house, MPs were elected based on population distribution, while in the upper house, the Senate, the Australian states were equally represented along American lines. There's a lot of study of the American Constitution and political arrangements when the Australian Constitution was formed. And Chamberlain was really a master of applying this sort of pressure. I mean, to give you another example, during the Anglo-Boer War, when there's a desire, Britain's fortunes are not going well in the Anglo-Boer War, there's a real desire to turn out Australian and Canadian troops as a sign of imperial strength and unity. He sends this wonderful series of letters to Canada and Australia saying, it would be really wonderful if you could offer us a spontaneous offering of troops. And there's a sort of lukewarm response followed by, I wonder how that spontaneous offer of troops is coming along. And so Chamberlain is sort of master of applying these unofficial forms of pressure to get what he wants from the colonies. Now, for British authorities, the consolidation of the Australian colonies under one national government had been on the agenda for several years. During the 1880s and 1890s, the difficulty of encouraging the 6 Australian colonies and New Zealand towards a common position on imperial issues, everything from Chinese migration to tariff and commercial arrangements to French and German activities in the Pacific to railway gauges and defence planning, had all frustrated imperial officials and even other imperial leaders like Wilfrid Laurier from Canada. There's this difficulty of trying to get anything done because none of the Australian colonies seem to come to a common position. In one farcical but revealing session of the 1897 Imperial Conference in London, discussion on a global reschedule of imperial mail timetables, affecting not only Australia, but Britain, Ireland, India, Hong Kong, and the Strait settlements, was soured by WA Premier John Forrest's refusal to make mail workers in the small town of Albany, a town of about 2,000 people, work on Sunday. So you have this incredible tension between these local political interests, the difficulty of perhaps losing the seat, which has made the local mail workers work on Sunday, disrupting the whole communications architecture of the British Empire. You can see why the British government was keen to unite the Australian colonies. But the desire of Joseph Chamberlain and other proponents of the idea of a more unified Greater Britain at the turn of the 20th century was, of course, also motivated by a more powerful impulse than the need to overcome bureaucratic and administrative divisions. Instead, it reflected the growing determination amongst British imperial leaders that the more efficient coordination of imperial resources was crucial to securing Britain's global interest in an age of intensifying great power rivalry. The time for small kingdoms has passed away, as Chamberlain informed the Australian opposition reader George Reid. The future is with the great empires. In the event, West Australian leaders proved sympathetic to these arguments. In July 1900, WA belatedly held a colony-wide referendum, the success of which enabled it to enter the Australian Commonwealth as a founding state, though the vote was heavily weighted geographically. The goldfields, where the population contained a large number of recent arrivals from the eastern states who'd come to go digging, voted strongly in favour, against a more marginal yes vote in many other areas and a strong no vote in the key agricultural and pastoral areas. And almost immediately after WA entered the Federation, frustrations began to emerge. There was a sense of having made a terrible mistake. As early as 1901, and then again in 1906, secession was mooted in the West Australian State Parliament. By the 1920s, in the wake of two royal commissions which highlighted WA's economic and political disadvantage, first the Sunday Times became an organ of secessionist sentiment, particularly on behalf of the newly formed Secession League. You can see here the precursors to Robin Wright's secessionist duo having a nice lunch there in Perth. This achieved relatively little before the election of the Conservative Mitchell government in 1930. But then, in the desperate swirl of the Depression, which hit Western Australia particularly hard as a primary producing state, and in light of the anxieties over potential expansion of Commonwealth authority, a reconstituted secession league, now the Dominion League, began campaigning for referendum on secession and for WA to return to something like its former status as a self-governing colony within the British Empire. And this is a point we'll come back to, but what they're very keen to achieve is not so much a new type of political relationship, but almost to go back to an old go back to an old version of the type of political relationship they had with Britain. Premier Mitchell, having thrown his support behind the movement, eventually agreed, and on the 8th of April 1933, as Rob said, 2/3 of West Australian voters voted to secede from the Commonwealth. At the same time, however, in an act which has left scholars arguing about their motivations and scratching their heads ever since, voters unceremoniously turfed out Mitchell's government, installing a Labor administration who awkwardly had opposed secession, but were now committed to recognising the will of the people. So you have this remarkably difficult political situation where the government, who had been in support of the referendum, the state poll and the referendum on the same day, you have an overwhelming vote for referendum, but you've returned a government that's been campaigning against it. I think we might go to the next slide, if that's okay.
Yeah.
After the success of the referendum, the Labor government essentially pledged to honour the outcome of it, even though it had been arguing for the other side. And so a specially appointed committee prepared the 500-page case for the people of Western Australia. And after communicating with the Dominion's office, confirmed that the 3 petitions Rob showed will be presented, one for the King, one for the Commons, and one for the Lords. These were conveyed by the party that you can see here: J. McCallum Smith, the prominent secessionist and owner of the Sunday Times; Keith Watson, the chap we saw lugging the petitions in the previous image, who's the chairman of the Dominion League and really the key driver. And they were joined, as Rob said, in London by Hal Colbatch, the WA Agent General, and the state government's legal advisor, Moss. Now, just again, a bit of context on the architecture. The Agent Generals, for anyone who knows what that term means, Traditionally, the Agent General had been, we have a governor, of course, in Australia, or the other colonies representing Britain. The Agent General was a representative of the colonies in London. And as the colonies gradually emerged to political independence, their remit expanded, but initially it's mainly about commercial intelligence that they're providing to London and to the London finance community. Now, the events which followed have been explored many times, and for our purposes today, I can just summarise them very briefly for you. Increasingly concerned by the momentum of the secession campaign in both Perth and London, the federal government in Canberra privately expressed concerns to the Dominion's Office and prepared its legal argument. So as Rob said, initially the Australian federal government had not taken this very seriously, but the efforts of this delegation, the attention they're getting in the British press, and their ability to sway opinion in London actually starts to lead to a bit of panic about, oh dear, what happens if certain sections of the British public get behind this delegation from Western Australia. For the British government, which of course was just anxious to avoid embarrassment in all this, as the British government often is, the worst situation would have been caught between Western Australia and the Commonwealth. And so the issue of receivability of the petition became the focus and was punted into a joint parliamentary committee, the classic tactic of British politics. That committee eventually concluded that the petition could not be received by the British government. Westminster could only intervene in matters affecting the whole Commonwealth. Secession, of course, would not impact just Western Australia, but the whole Commonwealth of Australia, upon the definite request of the Commonwealth conveying the clearly expressed wishes of the Australian people as a whole. As such, Western Australia's petition was deemed not receivable by the British Parliament. For the secessionists, this proved a fatal blow. With time, improving economic conditions, the advent of the Commonwealth Grants Commission, and the new geopolitical realities of the later 1930s, of course, World War II was not a very popular time to be appearing as a secessionist movement. Western Australia and the world gradually moved on.
Now, it's our contention that Western Australian secession not only acquires a greater meaning when we frame it in the context of imperial politics, the movement itself looks different when we give full play to how it imagines the future of the British Empire and WA's place within it. And so with the rest of the time we've got, we'll focus on two questions we've been examining: the Imperial Imaginary of the case for secession and the Imperial Implications of the case of the vote to secede. First, the imaginary. Before 1930, in the foundation of the Dominion League, arguments in favour of secession tended to draw small crowds and focus on the details of the tariffs and financial disabilities imposed on the state. By the time of the referendum, however, secession had become something of a mass movement. And while the Depression, of course, clearly contributed to its newfound popularity, it's our hypothesis that the wider Imperial Imaginary set out by the secessionists, the appeal of the idea of a new British Dominion and of closer, revitalised links with the Imperial Metropole, that this also played an important part, one underrepresented in the current scholarship. Secessionists routinely claimed that WA had a special relationship with London, that their loyalty to King and Crown exceeded that of the Eastern states. This came in for some mockery from the press in those states. Writing in the Australian Quarterly in 1933, F. Gregory, an advocate of secession, contended that the 1926 Dominion Conference had conferred on any Dominion the right to leave the empire. Judged by the pronouncements of Eastern politicians, he warned, some such mad proposal may readily emanate from Australia's political leaders, in which case, why should not WA be permitted to divorce herself from a union that has become unbearable? At the League's 1931 conference in Perth, delegates saw in Canberra's high tariffs a policy for the isolation of Australia from Great Britain and the weakening of imperial ties, all of which is gravely inimical to the best interests of the British Empire. If the British Empire is to maintain its greatness, the conference continued, the stimulation of reciprocal trade between the United Kingdom and her dominions is imperative. Secession, then, was in the best interests of the Empire and Westralia alike. Such professions of empire loyalism were, no doubt, often sincere, but they also served a tactical purpose. After all, the secessionist strategy was built upon winning support from the imperial centre. But it also explains why Ireland was less commonly used as a point of reference in the secessionist literature. And this is surprising, because in many ways, it offered the closest example of what the creation of a new Dominion of Western Australia would actually look like, as the Dominion's office itself quickly perceived. Indeed, the Dominion's office hand, writing in 1934, having conducted a thorough examination of the petition, observed, confidentially, that while the secessionists argued a new Dominion of Western Australia would add wealth, strength, and lustre to the British Empire, the report actually concluded that a close analysis shows that their provisions follow in all cases very closely, and in a number of cases almost verbatim, the provisions made with regard to the establishment of the Irish Free State. And a similar squeamishness kept references to the Confederate South in secessionist literature to a real minimum as well. Instead, secessionist literature put forward a striking and distinct geographical imaginary, which we're still exploring. On the one hand, it was marked by the talking up of the power of a sea of sand across the Nullarbor Desert to divide Eastern and Western economies, sympathies, political identities, and futures. The divisive power of that desert was a point contested in the Case for Union, Canberra's official riposte to the Case for Secession. But it did achieve some cut-through in London. The Times, for instance, on the day of the referendum and before the result was known, explained to its readers that the state was separated from the rest of Australia and from the seat of the federal government by the vast uninhabited tract of Central Australia, and that no state maintains a more pronounced individuality or a sturdier local patriotism. At the same time, secessionists stressed WA's orientation northward and westward, towards the empire in Asia and the mother country. Now, historians readily acknowledge WA's place in Indian Ocean world networks of exchange. To pick just one example among many, Westralian horses formed part of the remount trade of the Indian Army. Here, however, westward commercial connections were made to signify a future and more authentic political orientation. Maps like this one pointed out Perth's proximity to Singapore, 2,225 miles, relative to Sydney, 2,260 miles. WA's trade, natural trade flows north and west and is profitable. That to the east is a drain. In defence terms, too, the Case for Secession deplored how Australia's defence establishments were all clustered in the east, stressed that the state could not be more undefended under secession than it is today, and insisted that it was already accustomed to looking to the imperial authorities for serious protection anyway. The standard line became that Perth's distance from Canberra was further than from London to Moscow. Moscow, a city not chosen by accident, for secessionist propaganda routinely painted the economic and social agenda of the eastern states as illiberal, un-British, even Soviet. Now, a racial imaginary also ran through the secessionist platform, stressing that their new dominion, free from the restraints imposed by Canberra, would be uniquely receptive to taking white British immigrants from the metropole. As Hal Colbatch told backbench Conservative MPs in a meeting of the 1922 committee, a free Westralia would be an expanding economy, thirsty for labour, and able to take all the immigrants that Britain could send its way. Germany was not the only country with a Lebensraum problem, as he put it. Canberra, in contrast, had mismanaged larger white immigration programs like the Empire Settlement Scheme. And the secession campaign tapped into unease at the rates of immigration into Australia from southern Europe in the 1920s. We are all from the old Anglo-Saxon and Celtic stock, which never knows defeat, ran a secessionist pamphlet in 1931. Australia would be free to meet the demands of Great Britain's surplus population and to people the so-called empty spaces of Australia's western third, the exploitation of which was actively being suppressed by the demands of membership of the Australian Commonwealth. In making this case, secessionists themselves presented an image of WA as a place out of time, as fundamentally out of step with the rest of the continent. After all, self-government here came decades after it had been granted to New South Wales and Victoria. For a long period after responsible government was conceded to the eastern states, Gregory argued, Western Australia's destiny was dominated by Downing Street. And the implication of this extended experience of direct rule was that the states had a built-in complementarity with Britain that other states could neither match nor understand. With a low population density, rural economy, and thirst for white migrants, the secessionists of the 1930s put forward a distinctly 19th century vision of colonial development, one which would not have been unfamiliar to Joseph Chamberlain and his concept of an empire of complementary economies, which he termed somewhat grandly the Great Estate. Under federal protectionism, the state's consumption of British goods collapsed from £4 million to £1.5 million per annum in the decade since 1923. In contrast, a free trade dominion of Western Australia would reverse that decline. It would also reverse the alleged policy of the federal government to induce our people to abandon country life. It was as a primary producing rural society that WA would cement its new relationship with Britain. This too intersected with broader interwar neo-romanticism throughout the British world, particularly, but not exclusively, on the British right, with its heightened interest in the countryside and in idealised rural communities. And again, this was of more than commercial advantage to Britain. Because an independent Westralia would be free to develop its resources, increase its population, and to give that population a life away from crowded cities, whether in the eastern states or in the British Isles, Westralians would become better imperial Britons. Such growth would also, in time, provide the means for Westralia to take up a more active role in imperial defence. There's lots more to be explored here in terms of how the secessionists imagined an imperial future for their polity, including their belief that the 1931 Statute of Westminster, in elevating the authority of the Commonwealth government, threatened the unity and integrity of the British Empire, as they argued. Nonetheless, in seeking to become a self-governing colony under the British Crown, the secessionists chose to place themselves in the hands of the Imperial Parliament. Western Australia has a peculiar claim upon your consideration, Colbatch pointedly reminded Conservative MPs, for it was pressure by the Imperial Parliament that drove her into federation in the first place. Now, of course, secession didn't plan out as its advocates planned at all. And that brings me to the second of the two themes that we're exploring, the imperial implications of the vote to secede, when imperial imaginations, if you like, collided with imperial realities. As J.H. Thomas, our Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs, acknowledged, Western Australian secession was fraught with implications for imperial integrity and governance near and far. As Thomas learned from successive secret dispatches, news of the referendum result had been keenly watched in parts of Tasmania and South Australia. He also feared it would offer a precedent to Natal in South Africa and to certain Canadian provinces, and we're looking to follow up how news of the referendum is actually reported there, as well as further evidence of direct communications with secession's advocates like Watson. At a more fundamental level, however, Western Australian secession focused attention on a recurrent concern of interwar imperial policymaking. And this was the fear that federations, such common features of the British constitutional response to challenges to imperial authority, didn't actually work, or at the very least, needed careful review. There's a number of ways to explore this, but in the interest of time, I'll focus on just one. The WA delegation got a lot of attention in London in the winter of 1934 to 35, but theirs was not the only show in town. 2 days after the flag of the Dominion League was unfurled on the Strand and the succession petitions presented to the UK Parliament, the Great Government of India Bill, a leviathan of legislation, Britain's signal attempt to contain the forces of Indian nationalism some 7 years in the making, this bill was finally introduced into Parliament. And this was not the only way in which the histories of WA secession and Indian Federation proceeded curiously in sync. Westminster's Joint Select Committee on Indian Reform was appointed 1 week before the WA referendum. The hearings on the merits and demerits of receiving the secession petition took place in the middle of the heated parliamentary debate over the India Bill. And within a month of the WA delegation leaving London in defeat, with Keith Watson pledging to renew the struggle from home, the Government of India Act finally received royal assent. It would be a mistake to dismiss all this as mere coincidence. Both political events were, in part, a response to Britain's effort to rebalance its global influence in the long shadow of the First World War. Moreover, the arguments about these events became actively entwined, so that much of the attention that the WA delegation got in London was because of its implications for some of the central issues in imperial politics of the day. And it's worth stressing this point, this is no sideshow. The India Bill would prove to be one of the most bitter struggles in the long history of the ruling Conservative Party. A bit of context here about this bill. The idea for an all-India federation was first proposed in 1930 by the Indian princes, those nominally sovereign Maharajas, separate from British India proper, and who governed about a third of the subcontinent in dialogue with British advisors. It was welcomed by British politicians as a way to devolve political responsibility while still safeguarding core British allies and interests. But as time passed, princely support for federation began to slip away, so that the so-called Tory diehards, like Winston Churchill, like George Lloyd, now hoped to resist attempts at Indian reform altogether. For these critics, whose campaign was built around stressing the unworkability of Indian federation, the secession of WA came at just the right time. A number of them went so far as to express their sympathies with the secessionist cause. Sir Basil Peto, for example, pointed to Western Australia's inability to remain in a federation even without the cleavages of race, caste, and religion characteristic of British India. Citing secessionist literature, he reminded members that Travancore, the Indian kingdom with which he himself was best acquainted, and I quote, happens to be almost precisely the same distance from the centre of population in Western Australia to Canberra. What we are proposing is the federation of a part of India as far away from the centre as Western Australia is from Canberra, and this at the very moment when WA wants to get out of the federation. So Charles Oman went further, declaring the idea of federation to be a 19th century and 20th century delusion, now shown to be hopelessly out of date. In the Lords, George Lloyd led the charge by pointing to WA for proof of the tensions and discontent endemic to hastily constructed federations. Indeed, Lord Lloyd kept a fascinating private folder comparing examples and theories of federation at this time, and actively corresponded with Hal Colbatch on this matter. In Australia, Lord Lloyd concluded, the result of the federation has been that state is against state, and each state is either exploiting the federation or being exploited by it. Now, in India, the government risked setting up a system that every single federal country would discard today if it knew how to get out of it.
Thanks, Rob. Let me just say a few words on our behalf in conclusion. Folks, I realise it's Friday afternoon there and your coolers will be working hard, so let me just say a few words to wrap up on behalf of Rob and I. To conclude, it's our contention that re-examining this story with an eye to its imperial connections not only reveals a host of forgotten actors and dynamics at work, it also forces us to rethink the character of secession itself. To give an example, today the State Library of Western Australia's website neatly summarises this story with what is probably the prevailing view, that the Dominion League was merely a protest movement people were happy to support only because they suspected that secession could never succeed. On the contrary, Rob and I would argue that the imperial nature of its positioning and its arguments may be more alien and more incomprehensible to modern consequences, but it's critical to understanding the phenomenon in the context of the 1930s. As it turned out, both WA secession and Indian Federation ultimately came to nothing. It's a further connection between these two political projects, and both have received short shrift in historiography because of their ultimate failure. Keith Watson's angry call to seek unilateral secession after London had failed to hear WA's case fell on deaf ears. Despite the passage of the India Bill in 1935, the threshold required to bring its federal aspects into effect was never crossed. In both cases, however, that's a victory for hindsight that we're trying to push against in this paper. To a number of political insiders and outsiders at the time, these futures mattered and seemed almost within their grasp, so that a vote for secession that would never take place informed the prospects of a federation that never happened. And to turn as our final thought to, as always, the wisest voice in the room, the account from Missouri. In April 1933, the St. Louis Globe Democrat reported on the issue under the heading Australian Federation Splitting. A mounting secession movement in Australia, which other parts of the world have not failed to mark in recent months, reached its climax last week. By a vote of nearly 2-1, the state of Western Australia decided to withdraw from the Federation. Reaction from hard times, which has made itself felt in the politics of almost all other important countries, takes the form of a demand for a new pattern of government, rather than a new personnel of government. It comes less than 6 months after the framing of the Ottawa Trade Treaties, supposed to confer financial benefits and bring British units into closer bond. Though uncomplicated by slavery opinions, the vote brings up as knotty a question as the one in this country early in 1861. West Australia is a state of agricultural products and raw materials, and, like the Old South, it obtains little of the advantage which other states obtain from high tariffs and thinks it is slighted in public improvement programs. Even more closely than Canada, our model of federation was followed in Australia, it's the American model, and has not escaped some of the problems we solved more or less successfully years ago. However, South African Union was patterned more remotely after ours, and that federation has also a secession question to which West Australia's vote may give new impetus. We might suspect that, as in Western Canada some months ago, disunion talk is a bugbear by which minorities force concessions from majorities. At any rate, secession has no such displeasing associations in British territory as it has in American territory. But while Rob and I are always careful to question any wise words that emerge from Missouri, it's important to note, I think, that while WA secession remained peaceful, it does offer us, I think, a hitherto neglected window onto the swirling dynamics of imperial and international politics in the 1930s, and particularly this question of political federations and their future. If, during the interwar period, the height of Britain's global territorial expansion, you couldn't even keep West Australians happy with the organisation of the empire, what hope did London have of keeping the whole imperial show on the road? Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, there's plenty of time for questions and comments. True.
By the 1930s, when this became more of a mass movement as part of the Great Depression, which of the this is the first question, I have another, sorry. By the mass movement phase, which of the reasons for secession were most framed in like bread and butter terms to ordinary people for their economic conditions? Like, was it that thing about being a rural breadbasket, possibly? Second question, was more direct action than parliamentary petitioning ever called for as part of the mass movement?
Ben, how about I take the second part and you take the first? Does that sound good? So the second part. Well, no, this is the first part. That makes sense.
Thank you very much for the credit. Forgive me, folks. My vision is essentially wrong. So I'm doing that difficult Zoom thing of trying to make eye contact with everyone I can't see. So it's a fantastic question. I mean, I think one of the ideas. Western Australia is essentially a primary producing state. So wheat and sheep in the classic Australian model, but
particularly from the 1890s, the state had been transformed by a gold rush, where there's a fairly significant American presence, actually, particularly in terms of mining engineers who came to Western Australia. A president indeed showed up, or future president. But essentially what had happened was that the collapse in commodity prices had particularly hurt the West Australian economy. Western Australia also, as Rob mentioned, had this interesting idea of essentially sort of reverting to an old style farm colony. Whether that idea still actually existed in Britain is maybe something we can come to, but one of the chief grievances was by abolishing tariffs between Australian colonies and imposing international tariffs, Western Australia would have been much better buying things like agricultural machinery, mining machinery from the US and Britain, but it was essentially forced by these tariffs to buy them from the eastern states, which made the operation and mechanics of agriculture and mining much more expensive than they otherwise would have been. So this mounting, it's essentially a staple economy in many ways, or I guess a few different staples, and so that the collapse of those prices has a really disproportionate effect. There's very little diversification apart from into where the manufacturing sector is quite small. One of the problems with Australian Federation too, of course, is that the eastern states, particularly Melbourne, which at the turn of the century was the sort of great Australian manufacturing city, had been built on a very strong protectionist system. And so the abolition of state-based tariffs really removes the opportunity for Western Australia to develop a strong manufacturing sector earlier in the 20th century. I'll turn to Rob for direct action.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So the direct action question, this is great and something that we're working through more now. It's really driven by Watson. Watson is very upset, and you can kind of understand his position. Before they sent off the petition to London, the Dominion League of Western Australia writes to the Speaker of the House of Commons and says, we just want to be absolutely sure if we go this route to try and achieve our goal, sending a petition, that it will be received and we can have a discussion about it there. And the answer he gets from the Speaker of the House of Commons is that, yes, that will be fine, or that will likely be fine. What he then discovers on getting there is that the Speaker won't receive the petition at all, and it gets punted to this Parliamentary Select Committee. Extremely loaded Parliamentary Select Committee. One of the people on it is Leo Amory, one of the arch kind of imperial thinkers of imperial unity, and is never going to agree to this. And it's that committee that then rules that the petition is not fit to be received at all. So Watson doesn't hold back, and particularly in the Perth press, he publishes these astonishing letters that are really, full guns turned on London. I've been betrayed by the Secretary of State. The Speaker of the House of Commons basically lies to me. And there is this kind of ominous threat in them that he's going to do more to we will then foresee some form of unilateral declaration of our new Dominion status. There's also a correspondence he enters into with Irish politicians at this time, which is much more exploring some of those possibilities along that line. And that's something we're still going to dig up a bit more and do a bit more work on. What's interesting is that actually the act of publishing those letters in Perth seems to actually kind of kill enthusiasm for this. It's seen as, what do you think, Ben? Too gauche, beyond the pale? It's not the dumb thing to do. I think that's the issue. And it starts to eat away at the credibility and the legitimacy of the movement itself very quickly. Even though, to be fair, this particular grievance seems right to me. He is told one thing by the Speaker in advance, and on arrival is told something very, very different. And they have built their entire strategy around this submission to London. So his anger is not totally misplaced in that sense.
Rosie, then Billy.
I was quite interested by what you got up here with the telling people how to learn thing. I guess it kind of put me wondering in terms of your concept of imaginaries. How much was this rural, maybe even older imaginary, more widely shared out, so you kind of focus on a few big players, and how much was this more of a wider imaginary picture?
Ben, do you want to kick off?
Forgive me, but sorry, I didn't quite get the audio for that one.
Okay. So,
Would you mind relaying it, Rob?
yeah, sure. So Rosie was asking about how far we think our posited kind of Imperial Imaginary goes beyond just the kind of architect leaders that we're looking at, and how far it's more widely shared amongst the electorate in April 1933.
Rosie, thanks for a fantastic question. It's a really wonderful suggestion. I mean, what's interesting is, and Rob and I, readings of time, sort of haven't gone too much into it for you here, but the political machinations at the top really do reflect what's going on in the grassroots. So there are lots of things like community town hall meetings, various, particularly on the agricultural side, who are very pro-secessionist. It's very geographically located in agricultural regions. As I said, the sort of vote is very strong in those traditional pastoral regions and agricultural regions. And so I think it does really reflect the grassroots movement. I suppose the $1 million question, as we sort of discussed, is whether the idea that the debate is whether people voted for secession knowing couldn't happen. And I suppose you would say there's a certain thing. I hope this isn't too revealing of the secessionist duo, but it was when I started working on this topic with Rob that I realised through my entire childhood, my mother had a copy of this secessionist how to vote card from the newspaper hanging on a wall in our house alongside some other kind of significant historic family things. And I don't think I'd ever given it any thought, but there's been this recurrent theme in Western Australian history that's pushing against the Federation as hard as you can in order to maximise Western Australia's position. Because it is very different to the other states. I mean, at the time of Federation, when Australia has roughly just less than 4 million people, not counting the Indigenous population, WA is roughly about 4 or 5% of that. So you have this great anomaly, you have this enormous territory. The American newspapers often talk about it as 4 Texases to sort of frame it for American audience, with a tiny settler population. So it's a very unusual place, and in that context, grassroots politics, I think, can work quite differently to say in the big eastern cities, which would be much more akin to the sort of political architecture you see in the United States, larger urban setting. Does that add some
Yes, thank you very much.
context? Thanks for a great question.
Okay, our local Australian, Billy.
All right, yeah, this local Australian is not quite a lot, so, so thank you.
I was dreading Billy asking a question.
My question kind of went along some similar lines to Brady's. I was also looking at that card and the very Australian aspect of it, the also.
Yeah.
Which maybe one question about this was that a lot of the images, even if this one, what appears to be perhaps not half masculine, that they were all men, right? So, firstly, are there women voting in this? I mean, my impression was that women can vote by this stage in Western Australia and at federal levels. And so I was wondering what kind of component women have to this secessionist agenda. And then I was also kind of wondering about the Imperial Imaginary as well, and taken by its direction into indignation. And just wondering how much of that had any kind of identity crisis going on with it, right? I mean, if they start looking in that direction, connect themselves with all of these Asian countries, are they feeling like they're perhaps going to be in a place where they're disconnected from, say, Captain Cook in the first fleet, and this whole kind of imperial history that they would have felt a part of?
Yeah, well, on that first point about women's participation, just general kind of broader participation, I guess, you're right in that a lot of the kind of celebratory Australia shall be free dinners are pretty pretty standard kind of demographic. But the Dominion League of Western Australia archives in the State Library do have some interesting things where people write in from local chapters, and they have some local discussions in those local chapters and verbatim records of their, results and pronouncements. That does point towards a wider kind of participation, but
From the voting, it has to be compulsory.
right. So yeah, in theory, but I think the dominant voices are very male. So yeah, and that's for the Indian Ocean world orientation. That's a really good question, because I think it's not really sketched out fully by the secessionists. There's a few kind of nice lines that they can make, like the Singapore is closer than Sydney thing. I do think there's actually, there's a good empirical case can be made for WA's long historic integration into Indian Ocean world networks, and I'd like to look at that a bit more, the extent to which there's actually get more explicitly activated in some of the other bits of secessionist literature. I think there's more for us to look at there. But you're right, in theory, you also lose as well as gain when you shift your orientation. Ben, do you have more to?
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for confirming my fear. You asked a great question, Billy. I think in terms of gender patterns in voting and so on, we're sort of trying to work a bit around this at the moment. The turnout for the referendum is affected by the fact it's on the same day as a state election. So you have people voting not just for this, but also for the state poll. And as we mentioned, sort of one of the really confusing things to decipher here is that they, the party that's been campaigning for secession is unceremoniously turfed out. In terms of prominent women, I think actually, as Rob said, I mean, my sense is the secession campaign is quite masculine, where there's a really prominent role played by a prominent female leader is by the Prime Minister's wife, Dame Lyons, who is a really pioneering woman in Australian politics in her own right. Later on, she's still quite young in this period, but Rob mentioned that the hugely unsuccessful attempt by the feds to come over and screw the Federation, where the Prime Minister, you can see on the right there at the screen, is shouted down, pelted with coins. It's basically, I mean, most of the accounts say if they wanted to secure the vote for secession, their tour basically did it. But the one person who does win some sympathy is Dame Edith, who I think is quite respected in the period, and does at least ensure that the Federation Party gets a hearing in many cases. She's also a wonderful diarist, so as well as her prominent political career, she plays a significant role in the Menzies government, which follows later. But she really gives us a window onto the federal side of the campaign and accompanies Lyons to London when all this is happening there. So it's a great question. My sense is it's actually a very masculinist campaign at the top level, but as Robert says, it's when you get down to those sort of town hall meetings, when they're engaging with the local community and organising, that's sort of the level at which women are participating in the campaign. On the Asia thing, I would just say that WA is quite unusual in that it has places like Broome in the north where the curling industry is. There's a Japanese community. There's does have the same sort of restrictive legislations by this stage that the rest of Australia has, obviously. But there is this interesting theme within this campaign that WA is closer to, really its interests could be with Batavia and Singapore, and it maintains this sort of connection, particularly with Southeast Asia, much more than it should be reaching out across the continent. So that imaginary Rob was talking about, I think, understandably, we sort of have an image in our head of the Australian continent when we think of the nation, but there are certainly some competing threads here. And obviously at the time of Federation, there's a whole question about whether New Zealand will be part of Australia, even whether Fiji will be for a time, which Australia has some colonial oversight over. So that sort of question of what the final territory will be is very much in debate. And because WA joined so late, it's not actually in the preamble to the documents. It sort of missed the boat So there's an interesting sort of fluidity, I think, to where the borders of Australia are in this period, or at least in imagination.
Yeah, so since so much of this exists in imagination, I was kind of wondering where it sits in the historical memory of the region. Yeah, if you guys could talk on that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of coming back, isn't it, Ben? I think that's the thing. And you know, a few when I was over doing some work in WA, I was quite struck by the widespread use in the press of Waxit, as a kind of, which is kind of odd, because in many ways, if the Brexiteers had studied this case, then maybe they'd pause before pulling the trigger. Who knows? But it seems to me there is a kind of live feedback loop. There is memory of it, certainly, and it kind of gets. When I was chatting about it with the state librarians, they were extremely keen to sort of point out how overwhelming the vote had been, and it was this remembered experience. But I think, you know, current events have put a very different kind of sheen on it, and it's being reimagined in a very, actually quite a profoundly different way. But nonetheless, the visual symbolism of that Western Third being a different colour or different hue, right, that we showed on that original thing in the Facebook post, I mean, that's very visually resonant.
And just to give everyone a practical application of this, I think as of the changing rules they're swirling around in Australia at the moment, I think it's probably easier for me to go to London than it is to Perth at the moment, where you know, it's been 2 years since we've been able to cross virtually into Western Australia with a few breaks that we've not quite managed. So it is this quite exceptional period where, as Rob says, the story of secession, the Premier at the moment has used it very wisely politically to sort of whack the eastern states. But I suppose where it appears in memory at the moment is things like Western Australia will release a list of the OECD's best performing economies, with Western Australia number 3rd, admitting that it's not currently an independent country, but if it was, it would be performing at such a high level. So in the historical memory, I would say, I think, as I said, it's always been, there's an interesting argument going on at the moment, and there might be, you know, real American implications for thinking about this, but that essentially Australian Federation is hidden to people who live in the cities of Sydney and Melbourne, because for 99% of the time, the interests of Sydney and Melbourne are completely in line with the national capital. COVID has thrown that into slight chaos, and so for a moment Australians have remembered they have a federation, but in the smaller states, I think that recognition is ongoing because of the constant struggle to assert the position of these smaller states against Canberra.
Andrew.
So that's a pretty similar question, or I guess a continuation of it. From your talk, it seems pretty convincing that this is an issue with more like wider imperial connotations and implications. So I guess, generally speaking, do you have any idea why it hasn't been framed that way in the past? Or is that because of, I know that potentially like way too big of a question, then we can skip over it if you want, but is that because of sort of like new modern context that got you thinking this way? Or like why has this not been fit into like an imperial history, I guess?
I guess there's kind of a stock answer here about why the imperial gets squeezed out in our histories. Obviously, the power of the nation state as the framework for performing national history does bite here. And then on the other hand, you know, the idea of global history also has an appeal. But, you know, the imperial, this kind of intermediary stage, if you like, does have real consequence. And I think this is one of those areas where it's there. I also think it's fair to say, Ben, that in a lot of sort of Australian national history, how you talk about these imperial connections is quite fraught. It's not necessarily easy to know where to posit and put them. It's easier to tell this story as either a hyper-local one or as some kind of national framework. And the imperial dimensions of it have kind of got, I think, so watered out that the only remaining explanation for why it happens is it's an economic grievance. And I think that is too much of a disservice to the real phenomenon. To put the imperial back in gets the emotion back into it. And in that sense, reading the contemporary kind of slightly dismissive discussions of this is where the Brexit connection was immediately clear to me. how many people in the southeast of England describe Brexit as a purely economic grieves issue from the north and the west, right? And actually, to not appreciate the pulse, the emotion that goes into that decision is a huge disservice to the motivation. And I think comparably empire, actually in both cases, but let's say historical, has a place in that story, I think. That's my take anyway. By the way, that's why I'm interested in this verification.
Yeah, I think you articulated it really well, Rob. I mean, I think, and this has certainly been the case for scholars of American history, but I think not needing to subscribe necessarily to being a global historian or imperial historian, but I think having an eye to these different sort of meta levels of history, ironically can really liberate the local from some of the national discourses built up. I mean, the Australian history, like Canadian history, like New Zealand history, like South African history, has gone through its own process of decolonisation, just as with other parts of the empire, and that's of course had huge positives in terms of our understanding of the country and its development. But by the same token, I think it's led to some blind spots in terms of the legacy of how that national history is formed. I mean, this is, I suppose you could say, the story that we're telling, the type of appeal that these secessionists are making, as we said, is not for a new form of political arrangement. They're basically asking for a reset. It's the political equivalent of firing up the Wayback Machine to go back to the 1890s. And so it's not a narrative, I think, that sits within that Australian story of basically liberation from British history, which is how we tend to frame our national history, as most former places within the British Empire do. But for me, it's interesting because I think by shifting that point of focus to a point within Australia and sort of destabilising the nation, but also destabilising our accepted chronologies, I think that's one of the most powerful things we can do as historians. We all inherit these chapter divisions from previous scholars, and they're of course very valuable and very useful, but occasionally I think just rethinking the progression and the scope of that history, whatever we were working on, can reveal wonderful new things. And for Rob and I, of course, this very much happened in the context of Brexit, thinking about this little studied moment, just I suppose as European unification enabled scholars to think in new ways about localism within Britain, so whether it be Welsh nationalism or Scottish nationalism, Cornish identity, being part of these bigger narratives and able to do it at the same time, I think, to be liberated and interrogating the local. So I think that's very much been part of what we're trying to do here.
Erin.
Thank you. This is really interesting. I'm curious to push it towards the global level about the point that you made at the beginning about how we don't talk about this because it's unsuccessful. And I'm curious about how the failed secession movements of the 30s and earlier might have impacted that kind of decolonization, self-determination discussion that's happening after World War II. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
That's a great question. And it's one I really haven't got an answer for. Because when we talk about the federal moment in imperial history, we don't mean this moment. We mean the 50s and succession of federations that are drawn up in the context of decolonization. But of course, federation has actually been a much longer imperial response to forms of national pressure, Canada, for example. And this is one example where it's just not working. And across the empire, there's a reading that federations aren't working. Remember George Lloyd's folder, right? He's got a folder of failed federations that he looks at in the 1930s to prepare for this India debate. So I think you're absolutely right. This can't exist as a purely interwar story, though it definitely has interwar dynamics. It needs to be tied into a longer arc of how the British Empire plays with, thinks about, resorts to, falls back on, falls out of love with, falls into love with federations, which goes across the entire, well, probably, mid-19th through the 20th century. But in that context, you've got to hold on to what is distinctly interwar, but absolutely think about where this lies in terms of the recourse to decolonisation and the creation of yet more federations, most of which fail again, and most of which don't hold. So I suppose we can answer it a different way. Why are they so stubbornly resorting to federations when they've got case up with that folder's getting bigger and bigger. But yeah, it's a great question, to which I do not have an answer, but it's yeah, thinking about it.
Yeah, magnificent question. I would just remind everyone it's Saturday morning here, please go gentle on the historian reading in from overseas. What a magnificent question. I think for me, perhaps one way into it is thinking of it as, you know, this is the British Empire at its most stretched in the interwar. You know, we all think of World War I as this great crisis in terms of, but Britain comes out of it swollen, you know, having to manage even more territory. And so this question of how, and perhaps that speech from Thomas provides a bit of context here. You know, they're desperately feeling around. I mean, we've all been in that situation where we find ourselves juggling plates, and that's really what the Brits are doing in the 1930s. You know, they've got the League of Nations ticking along on one hand with its various problems that they're trying to take leadership on, and they've got their own empire. And I suppose part of why this interested Rob and I is we thought, in some ways, and I'm allowed to say this as a West Australian, we thought surely you could count on Western Australia to be one of the most boring, controversial parts of the British Empire in this period. And so it's a wonderful question about how the discussion about the future of federations and the failure of federation sits within that context of how do we keep all these balls in the air in the 1930s. And I think Rob and I certainly have some more thinking still on that. Yeah, wonderful question, thank you.
And a sort of related issue is that when you start to think about it sideways, it's one of a number of mooted federations in the 30s, which are also not pursued. So there is a broader history there of federal attempts, not just in the obvious context of decolonisation, but in the context of, I suppose you could say, the era of the two world wars, where the British are concerned to find larger, more stable political units they can try and rely on in this moment of geopolitical kind of crisis. But yeah, I need to think about it more.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there. We can take the discussion into the reception. Ben's going to stay on for another 2 hours drinking his Foster's beer. No, Ben, you're free. Thank you so much for coming in on a Saturday. A lot to think about this. Wonderful paper. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's a great joy to be with you, and the questions, as always, were magnificent. I always come to you for the serious questions. And I look forward to reconnecting with everyone once I'm allowed off the island.
We look forward to that, Ben. Cheers.
See you then.